So if you'd like to start by just saying who you are and why you're here.
My name's Susan Cole, and my daughter has fetal Valproate syndrome, and I've been running a Facebook group since 2011, and I've been campaigning since my daughter was born, or asking questions since my daughter was born, and I have also been involved with Oaks Charity early on, before 2005 or so, and more recently as well.
My name's Trish Greenhush. I'm a GP by professional training. I'm Professor of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford, and I suppose it's worth saying how I got into this. I'm not an expert on valproate. I've written books on evidence-based medicine, so I'm a sort of pluripotent, take a look at the evidence sort of person. I work in the same department as Carl Hennigan. But the reason I got to know Susan was because my son, who's now a junior doctor and at the time was a medical student, had written an essay on valproate and fetal effects and wanted to turn it into a paper, and so I got into writing and co-authoring a paper with my son, which then got picked up by various people and groups. Through that I got to know Susan, and she asked me to come along today, but we've already said that most of the hour is going to be hearing from Susan, and I've got some comments on that.
Right, thanks very much.
My name is Josephine Tapper. I am a woman with bipolar that was prescribed valproate for a number of years against my wishes, and was actually threatened with sectioning in 2006 when I questioned the teratogenicity. I spoke at the European Medicines Agency from my point of view, and sat on the ad hoc scientific advisory group there around valproate and bipolar, and I'm a member of the MHRA valproate stakeholder group.
Right, thanks very much. I'm not sure we're going to be able to have the full hour, but we'll try. But we've all got other commitments we have to honour this evening. So, Susan, are you're going to kick off?
Right, okay. Right, first of all, I'm representing, rather than, I don't consider myself to be a representative of a membership group as such. I consider myself to be a person with a lot of allies through Facebook groups and social media, and that's the way things have evolved. I've been quite involved in the development of this process, and I was very pleased when it came along. Right, where am I going to start? The area that I want to focus on today is patient group engagement. Although I wouldn't mind telling my story, but it's a long one. But when Jeremy Hunt brought the review about, he stated that the long struggle for justice for victims added insult to injury to the victims, and that's what I want to focus on. I think the review has been fantastic because we've got lots of important information and data and facts and figures through that, and we've got 50 pages of references to the evidence that's already been given. That's in a document that has been presented to you. So I'm not going to focus too much on that information. I would rather focus on the insult to injury aspect of this, how hard it is. I don't think it's quite. People don't understand how hard it is to be working for 20 years on this, and that doesn't apply to me. It applies to everybody. Next one. Yeah, one of the I want to talk about the good practice in patient group engagement and bad practice as well. What I've experienced in that. I'm not an expert on this at all. Probably Josie's much better at this, and has been, is versed in that. But it's interesting that despite all of the letters written to MPs over time, and despite parliamentary debates on Valproate far back as 1983, something we've discussed in a submission, the catalyst for this, I consider the catalyst for this review was our protest outside the MHRA offices in 2013. We had been writing letters, Oaks Charity from 2005, if not earlier, had been writing letters for 15 years to try to get information through, and it was that protest, I believe, that tipped the balance. And at that protest we had a handful of mums, and with their children. It was loosely organised through Emma Friedman and various people involved, and Joe Cousins, and we all just said, you know what, we're fed up with this. The only way we can get our message across is to literally stand outside the MHRA offices. Somehow that worked. So, yeah. So one of the things that Tricia talks about is well, she mentioned a thing about public speaking. Yes. And what I want to talk about is public listening. I think that it's about time there was more public listening, and I want to just go into that. But I don't know if this is where you want to take off. But we didn't have the facts. Nobody listened to us because we didn't have the facts. Nobody listened to us because we didn't have any credibility or integrity, or we weren't believed. And nobody really cared because they didn't put themselves in our shoes. Some of the reasons that have come forward to us, to me, and as a person that has a Facebook group and goes on Twitter, and also to Oaks Charity, is one of the reasons is because they didn't want their disability being exposed to the public. They've also been put off joining groups for whatever reason, or they've been excluded from a group, a patient group. They don't have the time to work on things, or they don't feel they have the education or the knowledge and the understanding, and I think accessibility is a big problem in getting heard. And then there are others who are afraid for their professional reputation. So you have those who have a good job and they don't want to present themselves too loudly. Right. Good practice. Valproate Stakeholders Network, others may have talked about this, but that's been an inclusive way of bringing people together. That started again after the protest. It began as a small group of a handful, I think it was about 5 people in the room at the Department of Health, and to discuss this. And I didn't get involved at first because I thought it was a damage limitation exercise, and I was completely cynical and didn't want anything to do with it. But over time, that process, the Valproate Stakeholder Network process, has been really useful, and it has moved people forward, and I think that's probably partly why we're here today. To have representatives from the MHRA, obviously, from all the different bodies, professional bodies, I can't list them now, but you probably know who they are, and they're largely the people that have given evidence to this review. To have them all round a table has been incredibly interesting. And there are good things that come out of that, I think. There are lots of really bad things that have happened as well in this process. But I'm sorry, I'll just have a pause now. I'm just and work out where I'm going. Right.
Do you want me to say something?
Yeah,
while
you
you're
say
resting?
something
Or do
while
you
I'm
want
having a
We can
proper
have 5
breather.
minutes. I'm sure they won't mind if we just.
No, they will.
Do you think they will? Do you think they'll put pressure on us? We could just refuse. All right. If you want to rest, do you?
Yeah, I'll have a
Okay.
rest.
Is that all right? If I? Okay.
It's your
It's your session.
Yeah, sure. So of course, being a doctor and a professor sitting on the patient side is I need to know my place. I'm not here to give an expert opinion. I understand that. So I wanted to amplify and comment on really what Susan said already today and the previous stuff that she's presented to you. From the perspective of someone who's done all sorts of things like expert witness work and been involved in inquiries before. So here's some comments. Firstly, I am struck by the clarity of the evidence. Nobody's in any doubt that this drug is teratogenic, that it's been known to be teratogenic for decades. As Susan says, we don't need to go into that, but it was quite striking that this isn't something that people were arguing about the evidence. The second thing I wanted to comment on, first of all, I'm absolutely in awe of Susan's leadership of an extraordinarily difficult patient campaign. This is not the kind of top-down leadership, start a campaign and everyone follows you. It's a classic sort of female leadership, really. It's like herding cats, because the different patient groups and perspectives are so diverse, and the different groups, in inverted commas, represent different clinical conditions, different interest groups that have been set up for different reasons, different levels of engagement with this particular issue. Some are actually not that interested in it or don't have time to support it. And a different set of claims to represent Valproate victims or whatever. And I think I am very struck by the heterogeneity in the different patient groups and different individual patient perspectives, and the way that Susan has managed to respect those and to a large extent pull them together. She doesn't speak for them in any simple sense, but I think she does an incredible job of synthesizing something that's not easy to synthesize. So I wanted to comment on that. The third thing that strikes me as someone who doesn't who hasn't been involved in this and has come quite recently, is that patient involvement, patient discussions, the shared decision-making discussions in these two main groups, women with epilepsy and women with bipolar disorder, seem to me to have slightly lagged behind what might be called accepted practice or best practice compared to other conditions that I've seen. And that is a subjective impression. I haven't explored that in great detail, but it just strikes me that, hang on a minute, why exactly were neurologists not having the conversations with women when there was quite clear evidence of heterogeneity? So that is an impression. Susan said, I think quite clearly, but I'm going to repeat something that she was talking about earlier. She said before we came in here, this is the most important day of my life. This is a huge, huge issue, as she said in I think in a very articulate way. The three things that Susan and others like her are concerned about is, first, the facts, that many were not informed of the facts and that shared decision making didn't happen at a time when perhaps it should have done, and therefore there wasn't informed consent. The second thing that they were concerned about, and which really I think resonates with my reading of what happened, was that they weren't seen as credible, and perhaps that is partly because the conditions are rather stigmatizing. Perhaps there's a thing about women not being seen as credible, I don't know, but certainly they have sometimes been told, well, hang on a minute, you've got a mental health condition, you've got epilepsy, you're not well, you're uneducated, you're troublesome, whatever. And I think that there's some learning points there. And the third thing, as Susan said, nobody put themselves in our shoes. There didn't seem to be empathy with what they were going through. So the last thing that I wanted to say about my own reflections and observations is what the Susan and the people that she's speaking on behalf of today, what they're after. And we've just had a conversation in the cafe, and the three things that came to me, and she'll correct me if I haven't got this right, is first of all, the question of whether there should be a full public inquiry into this or whether this is the inquiry. So I think we need to have some conversations about that before our hours are. Secondly, learning lessons about engaging with patient groups that are diverse and not giving you a single message, perhaps. And I think Susan may talk a little bit more about her idea for there to be a public advocate. And thirdly, the question of what might be called compensation, but I think that's a bit of an emotive term, because it seems to me that what most of these women want is to be able to afford to provide the care for their children that it's simply going to cost. So they're not talking, I think, primarily about taking drug companies to cleaners. They're talking about how can we afford to pay for the care of someone with a lifelong disability. And it is expensive to provide a high quality care for those individuals. So that is my one page of notes, and I'm now going to hand back to you. Please correct anything I've said that you...
No, you've done brilliantly in terms of making things concise, which is something I'm not brilliant at myself.
If you would like to speak.
I would just like to reiterate that the issues of certainly women with, and is a word I would use as well, stigmatising conditions, and also the fact that we are having to manage serious conditions whilst trying to engage with groups in an articulate, eloquent way. And the MHRA have been very supportive in that. I know that there's been issues along further back. I also, and I suppose that I sit, one of the issues has been that Valproate has not necessarily been not considered on a, it's been considered within the parameters of epilepsy initially, and that is because there's been a failure to engage by mental health charities and by psychiatry. So if I can just talk about my personal experience within the MHRA stakeholder group, I don't sit here representing all women with bipolar, and as I said at the EMA, my input is based on my experience. It's not evidential, although I've done a lot of work around it. So we're seen as, charities are seen as supportive of patients, but actually hasn't been where I've come from. So I've tried to engage charities. The MHRA have tried to get charities to engage with me. I am an individual. I've actually suffered, my bipolar has come to the fore again, so I've found it difficult to manage. And I've had responses such as, oh, well, we're a small charity, so we can't help you. Well, I'm an individual woman. And I found as well that the learned societies, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, so neurologists seem to have been quite engaged, for good or for bad. The Royal College of Psychiatrists have often been slow to engage, in fact with the MHRA as well. The other thing, objectively, that there has been an issue with is that within particular conditions, and I'm looking and observing epilepsy, there has been almost there has been a protectiveness amongst certain patient groups that they don't want to engage with other patient groups. And I liken that to its divide and rule, and I don't think that that's helped the process. It certainly doesn't help PPI, patient and public involvement, of which I do some work. And I think that that has been a real stumbling block. That if you have, it's almost like, I come from the corporate sector, and it's almost like you have sort of, there's intellectual property rights or commercial property rights that you might say within the corporate sector, and some patient groups have operated like that, and I think to the detriment of the women who suffer from valproate disorder and the families themselves. And I think it's been a missed opportunity and a bit sad, to use an emotive word.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Shall we go back to the issue of the public inquiry? Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, yes. We've had. So I was involved in the VAC litigation, which is the fetal anticonvulsant litigation that finished. We lost legal aid funding in 2010, and that case was against Sanofi. But a public inquiry through that process, the lawyers found a lot of redacted documents. Heavily redacted documents where pages and pages have been redacted. So the simple reason is we need a public inquiry because we need to actually find out what happened and learn from the past. It will also be a way of bringing together any question about any payment or compensation. We also need somebody to bring all these elements together. And we made a submission recently to the Department of Justice, which was to, and I think I sent you a copy, where they're going to set up a system of having a public advocate, an independent public advocate for public inquiries, but particularly in inquests where there's a sudden loss of life, say like Grenfell, for example. So that would be great to have something like that because it does bring everything together. So I think that public inquiry is essential really for us. And I speak as well for Oaks Charity because they were, I've represented them for quite a number of years as well. But that seems to be across the board. I don't know if all of the groups feel that way. And I think a public inquiry is the only way we can really learn from the past. Yeah.
It does mean, of course, a great delay because they take time to set up and
yes.
to run, and they are very costly. But I can understand that some people want a public inquiry.
Yes. I mean, we would like some form of interim compensation if that's at all possible. I mean, I'm not saying that is what women are demanding. If you could ask every woman on my Facebook group, and they would say, "I want something now. I want some compensation now." But it's easier said than done. It's a hugely complex issue, and when you're talking about compensation schemes, they have to be worked out very carefully. I haven't got the knowledge about that, but Emma Friedman and David Bodie, I think, are speaking or have spoken today, and they're much more knowledgeable about that sort of thing.
But we're not equipped to assess compensation. We need some real expertise in that, and we don't have it in the team. But certainly it's an issue that we obviously would want to address in principle.
Yeah.
And it may be about redress or whatever.
Yeah, I do think there's an inequality of arms as well, that you haven't got, so that you do have lots of patient groups struggling, and there's sometimes groups around a kitchen table, and there are charities, and the structures are difficult, and lots of people aren't trained, and these groups need support. I think if we could do something to help victims get together, or those affected get together, and have some kind of mediatory process with some funding, that would be wonderful. So there's supports charities to, they're consultants really, and they will sort of facilitate things. And a mediator or a facilitator to bring, not bring groups together, but to enable people to get support. That would be excellent. Most women want somebody that is experienced in the condition, rather than a telephone helpline, somebody that doesn't understand. Any questions?
Since we first met, which was a while ago now, we've been all over the country, and we've met in the 3 areas of the review a very large number of people, mainly ladies, who have suffered terribly. And so one of the questions, as you may have noticed, I've been putting to the people who've come to these hearings, from regulatory bodies, from professional bodies, is why is it that this has been going on for so long and my profession didn't seem to know, and the National Health Service didn't seem to know? So why is that? And what should we do to make sure this doesn't happen in the future? Do you have any answers to that?
I think there's a cultural problem in that women aren't believed and they're ignored. So there are primarily you could just say there's an institutional sex discrimination, discrimination against women and women's health. So there's a big problem with that, and I would like to propose, in fact, some of the other groups I've been in touch with have proposed a women's health, safety and health type of committee that would specifically look at women's issues. And then the second issue is because we have disabilities. So with us as Valproate users, if you like, we have a disability and we've been institutionally ignored at best of times. Many of us older women have grown up in an environment where even our families didn't really take us that seriously. We were slightly put aside, if you like, because we have a disability, and epilepsy in many cultures is still seen as you're possessed by the devil, and that globally, this is a global issue. So we're still dealing with that, and why it didn't come forward, it must have come forward to doctors. I think it did. I met recently with my daughter's paediatrician who diagnosed her in 2001, and he was at the hospital when he diagnosed her. But he told me at that time, I was a bit of a fog, but he told me that he had written a letter to all the GPs warning them about this. He knew how serious it was. He'd seen lots of cases in India. So doctors did know. I don't think there was really an excuse. I think the data that they had, the statistics, the numbers, were a bit vague. I think at best they were vague, and I think it was.
No, I think Tricia's right. The evidence has been there for decades.
Yeah.
That's, but it's taken patient groups working with politicians to bring this to the attention, and that's not.
Well, I have a group of envelopes here from Parliament. Going back a long time, So that hasn't worked, and as I said, I do think that us protesting outside the MHRA is what kicked this off, because we've had plenty of letters from members of Parliament all across time and across governments.
Is there? I'm also struck by the difference between this the length of time it took anyone to do anything about this versus thalidomide, which was once someone blew the whistle, something happened very, very quickly, and one would have thought that lessons would have been learnt more quickly. I wonder if it's partly because of the nature of the effect on the fetus, which is, I wouldn't say it's non-specific, but it's sort of neurodevelopmental delays. It's almost as if you're born without any arms. Do you know what I mean? It's less visible. It's quite pervasive, and it affects the individual and the family quite profoundly, and for the rest of their lives. But it's not quite as dramatic as something like thalidomide. Maybe that was one of the things.
Also the penetrance isn't as high. I think
Yes, I think that's
in
probably
terms
true.
of
That's
sort of
probably
if you
true.
look at
Yeah.
the statistics on actual physical malformations on Valproate, they are much, much lower than the visible manifestations. And as you say, the neurodevelopmental ones are so much less visible.
And the women may have been on more than one drug. So then there's question of, can you sort of trace it back? Whereas of course thalidomide was given for morning sickness, and it was usually the only thing one was taking, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We did interview the Thalidomide Trust and all that, and that's actually on the website.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I mean, it was a very visible consequence of taking thalidomide. One could see it, and I think with this, it's much more complex to actually discover exactly what the issues are really. Simon, you put in.
Well, I'm not sure it's a question. I've got more sort of an observation about what we've heard, and it kind of chimes with some of the things you've said. As you know, we've been out the country and we have met hundreds of people, including many families affected by Valproate. And I suppose one of the messages that comes out of what they've told us, which has been echoed today and by others in the patient groups, is the desire for something to happen sooner rather than later. That there's been this enormously long period in which the system collectively has failed to even listen, as you said, and then recognise that there's something that should be done. That's spanned 30 more years. And there's an almost a completely understandable weariness on the part of the people affected that it's just time for something to happen. And I think that plays heavily on our minds when we come to think about what we should be recommending and what influence we can have over what happens next. And it also comes back to the point about the public inquiry, because whilst we need to think about whether there is good reason for a public inquiry, we also have to balance that with the desire to try and do something to help people sooner rather than later. And as Juliet said, public inquiries can take years.
That's what we were talking about in the cafes.
Yeah, but I think you can do both. I think you
Yes,
can have
you
a public
might- well,
inquiry, and as I said, if you could have some support, and I know Rebecca Bromley and Peter Turnpenny have talked about specialist centres, that would be a godsend, because we have constantly have people saying, my son has this, that and the other, is this a feature of fetal Valproate syndrome, and we don't quite know, and there's so much guesswork in terms of the actual medical support. So I don't see why it should be an either-or situation.
No, I think you may well be right, but I think you've touched on something very important, that access to support, which is both clinical, medical support, but also educational and social support, is lacking, and where it does exist, it's haphazard. And something could and should be done about that, giving families that opportunity to access the support they deserve is something that shouldn't hinge on whether there's a public inquiry or not. That's kind of it's a separate point.
Exactly, and I think others have mentioned getting an MOT for the children. It's not a brilliant way of putting it, but for somebody to be able to look at my daughter and have a good thorough examination on a holistic level, so they're looking at the whole body rather than and mind, and support in that way.
That's entirely right and proper for anybody with a chronic illness, particularly a child. You need a multidisciplinary assessment on a regular basis and a care plan,
Yes.
and then a system for delivering it.
Yes.
Can I just say that,
Sorry.
I mean, I don't know what our conclusions are going to be about a public inquiry, but certainly we wouldn't set it up, the government would set it up, it's up to them to do that. And then it's up to them to decide what they want the public inquiry to look at. And it may be that they would want them to introduce the issue of compensation, in which case it would be very difficult to do much before that public inquiry was actually had resulted in its findings. But, you know, it's all open at the moment.
Yeah.
So we just need to think about it more.
I think.
Valerie, have you got questions?
But also, I suppose, a comment really, because going back to what you started by saying, Susan, which is these 3 points, the first 2 of which were no one's listening, don't seem to have any facts, and maybe we haven't got credibility because we're women. If you think about the 3 interventions we're looking at, actually that is absolutely the same across the piece, because we don't have the facts about any of them, and really it plays back into this point about justice, compensation, redress, however you want to look at it. We don't know the numbers involved, which is quite extraordinary across all 3. We don't know how many children are affected by this. We don't know how many were affected by intervention, and we don't know how many parents or women took
It's complicated,
so
isn't it?
That link between the 3 is really quite interesting, and maybe that partly explains why it has taken so long. And actually, here we sit after all these years, still not knowing the numbers.
Yeah, I've watched lots of the video evidence, and I've seen how many organisations have stood up. I mean, I'm talking about the main medical organisations, and they don't know, and they're trying. You know, NHS Resolution was an interesting one. It's so complicated to sort of pick apart those massive structures that have been there for possibly hundreds of years. Some of them, those institutions, it's so hard for them to get to work together. That's not my problem. That's not my issue. But something can be done because we're all grown-ups, and I'm sure you know. I think that would be really helpful to just keep going with this. And in terms of you know, how to stop this happening in the future, I really strongly believe that if you have a good way of listening to people when these things come up, when there are questions, if anybody goes to the government, sends their MP a letter saying this is happening, I don't like this, it's not right, something needs to be looked at. That Member of Parliament should not be going to the Health Minister and saying, what do you think of this? And they then say, well, this is the party line, this is what we're going to say. There needs to be a little bit more thought and connection with the departments that are supposed to deal with this sort of thing. And it's not good enough to say, we'll deal with that in the next Parliament.
Do you think the MPs, because I mean it's interesting that you've sort of chosen MPs as a route into this, because obviously that is part of support more to us here, but where do they fit into the overall picture?
They fit into the overall picture because they're our last resort. They are they're the structure that we have for democratic process, and when nothing else works, that's where you go. You go to your MP if you really need help, and they're elected. They're representative. So that's why. I did want to mention all party parliamentary groups, which I think need work as well. I don't think they are particularly well. Needs to be work on all party groups. Sometimes the secretariat is funded by pharmaceutical industry. They can often be exclude people. So I've never been I've been invited to one of the Valproate all party parliamentary group meetings, despite being very close to Norman Lamb, who's the chair. Not close in that way, but you know, I've had meetings with him, and he's a brilliant person, and I want to use this opportunity to thank him for he's really stuck his neck out and really gone beyond the call of duty to actually pick up on these really difficult, tricky issues where other MPs didn't. But yes, yeah, is that?
No, I was just interested to pick them because they. I was really interested in what you said because to me they are sort of, if you like, they are the last line. They're the point you shouldn't get. If the system works, you shouldn't get them there. So that was why I was just curious as to how do they fit into the whole.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, every medical institution should be listening, and I could go on for weeks about. And Josie and Trish could probably do a lot better job of talking about how to engage groups, but that's what my main focus is, as I said, wanted to get across today, because I do think that's the answer, is a really good solid structure that doesn't leave people on Facebook and Twitter to share information, that they're brought together, and I think that can happen. I don't think that would be very difficult, and I think we've seen from the MHRA stakeholders network that these things can happen.
I think
I'd say human factors is, I know it's a fashionable word at the moment, but I think that's an important factor. And you've got institutions, or you've got learning societies or royal bodies which have traditionally been very resistant to change and slightly reactive. And I think that there is work around human factors and sort of how it can be better communicated.
Well, I think you put it across very well. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a really useful session, and thank you for your colleagues here supporting you. It's very good. Thank you.
Done really well, hasn't she?